The boardroom was humming with tension as the final preparations for the investor demo came together. Sleek suits lined the polished conference table, laptops open, murmured small talk circling like anxious birds. The CEO stood at the front of the room, eyes scanning the deck on the oversized screen, lips pressed into a tight line. This was the day. Months of development, millions in funding, and a marketing push that could make or break the quarter had all led to this precise moment. A room filled with venture capitalists, analysts, and two potential acquisition partners sat poised, ready to see the company's groundbreaking new system in action. He took a deep breath, tapped the touchpad, and initiated the launch sequence. The room dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. Initial loading bars zipped forward. The CEO glanced over at the lead engineer, who gave him a small nod of confidence. He started his pitch, his voice strong and smooth, crafted, practiced. "This is the future of scalable AI-driven operations," he said, gesturing toward the screen. "What you're about to see isn't just software, it's a revolution in efficiency." Then came the click, the signal to activate the demo interface. Nothing happened. The screen stuttered. A blank white space filled the display where real-time analytics and predictive models were supposed to live. For a moment, the CEO assumed it was a lag, a temporary hiccup. He kept speaking, slowing his words slightly, buying time, but behind him, red error text bloomed across the screen like a virus. The system was crashing. Live, confused murmurs started at the far end of the table. One of the investors leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The CTO was already rising from his seat, crossing the room to the secondary terminal. The lead engineer's face was pale, fingers flying across a keyboard as he tried to reboot the system. "It's just a memory overflow," someone said quietly. "No, maybe a corrupted cache." The CEO stepped back from the display, no longer speaking, his breath suddenly short. Panic was creeping in fast. He had seen crashes before. He had even predicted one during early builds. But this version was supposed to be stable, tested, vetted, bulletproof. The crowd of engineers huddled at the side of the room grew thicker. Developers pulled cables, opened shells, checked logs. The investors were no longer whispering. They were openly discussing what this meant, whether the platform had been overhyped, whether the valuation was too generous. One of them was already typing something on his phone. The CEO felt a sweat break out across his back, cold and immediate. The presentation was slipping away, and with it, the faith he'd spent 2 years building in this room. His mouth opened, then closed again. There were no words he could offer that wouldn't sound hollow or desperate. The screen was frozen now, unresponsive, as if mocking the room. A red progress bar had appeared in the center, stuck at 12%. Beneath it, an error message blinked steadily, undecipherable to anyone but the engineers, and even they weren't sure what it meant. A tech support manager whispered that they could reboot to a backup version, but it would take 12 minutes. 12 minutes was a lifetime. By then, most of the investors would be mentally checked out, or already drafting polite emails explaining why they would be reallocating their focus this quarter. The CEO turned back to face the room, trying to summon some form of assurance, but all he saw were skeptical eyes and furrowed brows. One VC raised an eyebrow and tilted his watch toward himself. That small motion nearly made the CEO flinch. Someone from the engineering team said they'd never seen this bug before. Another muttered something about a deep kernel fault. The CEO heart was pounding, all the hours, all the planning, all the pressure. And now, everything was spiraling into a public implosion right in front of the people who mattered most. The lead engineer's fingers moved with increasing urgency, his eyes darting across lines of code that had been stable for weeks. Behind him, 2 junior developers attempted a parallel diagnostic on a secondary terminal, but their screen showed the same paralyzed system response. The CTO, standing at the center of the chaos, barked fragmented commands, check the rollback logs, see if the failover node kicked in, run the last stable build, but nothing responded as expected. In the corner of the room, the system's monitoring dashboard showed red across every metric. Memory spikes, CPU overloads, a mysterious loop in one of the service calls, all indications of a deep system failure. The room, once dominated by sleek professionalism, was now fracturing into quiet desperation. Outside the windows, the city shimmered with late morning sun, but inside, time was distorting. A minute felt like 5. Someone spilled a coffee trying to shift positions quickly. Cables tangled underfoot as someone connected directly to the server housing rack tucked in a back closet. An engineer with a Bluetooth headset tried dialing their off-site database specialist, hoping a remote insight might surface in time. No luck. Everyone who could be on a keyboard was already typing, hands twitching like surgeons mid-crisis. And still, the screen refused to change. The dreaded 12% loading bar sat like a monument to their failure. The CEO stood a few feet away from the action, frozen in a strange limbo. He couldn't help with code, and any attempt to reassure the investors now would ring hollow. The energy in the room shifted again as one of the junior engineers announced they had found a potential fix, something involving reverting a recent update to the front-end parser. The CTO leaned over her shoulder and quickly rejected the idea. "That update was patched last week. It's not the issue," he said curtly. She went silent, retreating back to her terminal, frustration blooming on her face. The investors, watching from their chairs, tried to hide their growing disinterest. One of them, the oldest with silver hair and a reputation for pulling out early from faltering tech, tapped twice on the table and leaned toward the partner beside him. Their quiet exchange was not so quiet anymore. Another pulled out his phone and started reading through emails, his interest visibly gone. The CEO felt the weight of each gesture as if it were personally cutting into his confidence. Still, the engineers tried. Someone suggested initiating a hot restart sequence, a method reserved for extreme cases. It would potentially reset the system's state without requiring a full reboot, but it was also risky. What if it causes data corruption? The CTO asked, more to himself than anyone else. "It's already corrupted," a voice responded from the back grimly. The tension spilled into arguments, fingers were pointed. The blame started to surface, creeping in like a storm surge. One engineer demanded to know why the real-time logging module had been disabled in the last sprint. Another insisted it wasn't their fault, that QA had signed off on the release. The QA lead, sitting near the edge of the room, crossed her arms and looked away. "We signed off on what we were given," she said flatly. Nothing was working. Nothing made sense. The AI models were supposed to self-correct these anomalies, but now even those systems were frozen. No output, no suggestions, not even an error message from the adaptive layer. It was as if the platform had simply given up. The CTO began to sweat visibly. His confidence, usually unshakable, was cracking. His voice wavered as he asked for the backend logs, more red text, lines of unfamiliar anomalies. A runtime loop from a module that wasn't supposed to be live, a reference to a deprecated API. The clock was still ticking, and the 12-minute backup solution had passed without action. Someone had quietly run it in the background, but even that failed. It got stuck halfway through the restore due to what looked like mismatched schema dependencies. Another engineer muttered a string of curses under their breath and dropped their forehead to the table. Across the room, keyboards were being pounded not just with urgency now, but with frustration. All the training simulations, the all-nighters, the system checks, the optimistic commits marked final version. None of them mattered now. The entire engineering team, usually a tight machine, was unraveling in real time, near the back of the room, away from the flurry of suits, lanyards, and technical chaos. Someone else had been sitting quietly, barely noticed, mostly ignored. A young boy, no older than 12, leaned against the far wall near a janitor's cleaning cart. His sneakers were scuffed, his hoodie slightly oversized, and a cheap pair of earbuds dangled from around his neck. He had come in with his father earlier that morning, tagging along on what was supposed to be a simple shift to polish the floors before the executive demo. Security had waved them through. and nobody had paid attention when the boy sat down to wait, his eyes occasionally drifting up from his phone to the large display. At first, he didn't fully understand what was happening, just that there was a lot of tension in the room, a lot of raised voices and stressed-out adults talking in jargon. Heavy bursts. He watched as they scrambled around the machines, heard them mention phrases like API hooks, loop recursion, and null pointer fault. His dad had already slipped into the hallway, heading toward the elevator, mop bucket rolling behind him. The boy stayed, not wanting to miss what looked like a rare chance to see something important, something alive. He had always liked computers. At home, he had an old laptop he'd fixed up himself. Parts scavenged from the recycling bin at school. Tutorials watched late at night on a cracked screen. His teachers thought he was just into games, but he had learned early how systems talked, how software behaved when it broke. Now, something about what was happening here tugged at him. The frozen screen, the strange 12% loading bar, the frantic commands from the engineers that didn't change anything. He watched a few lines of code flash by on a secondary monitor and blinked. One line looked familiar. Something about the sequence of the loading function seemed off. It was structured like something he'd read about, a misfire in an asynchronous call stack that could cause everything to stall if the trigger function didn't resolve. He sat up a little straighter, slowly pulling the earbuds from around his neck. His hands hovered over his hoodie pocket, unsure. For a moment he hesitated. It was ridiculous to even think it. He was just a kid. They were professionals, some of the best, judging by the size of the conference room and the badges. Still, he kept watching. No one else had seen the line. No one mentioned it. They were focused on something else, looking deeper and deeper into the wrong layers. He stood up, stepped a little closer. He didn't want to interrupt, but the tension was too thick to ignore. One of the developers glanced at him with mild annoyance, then back to the screen. The boy raised his hand awkwardly, then lowered it again. He cleared his throat, quiet but deliberate. Nobody heard. He tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me," he said. A few heads turned, not many, certainly not the CEO. But the CTO did look up, frowning, distracted. "Not now, kid," someone muttered near the corner. "This is a critical situation." The boy took another step forward. "I think I saw something in the function call," he said, trying to sound confident. "There's a loop in your async loader. It's waiting for a response that doesn't exist, so the system's stuck." A pause, not full silence. There was still typing, still muttering, but enough of a break for one of the younger engineers to look up, blinking. "What did you say?" The boy pointed at the second monitor. "There," he said. "You've got a dependency waiting on a call that can't return because the hook's being overwritten in memory. It's like a traffic jam where the stoplight turns green, but the sensors never see it." A few people turned fully now, curious despite themselves. Another engineer furrowed her brow and checked the console log. Her eyes scanned the recent entries, then back to the frozen bar. She looked again. Then again, the room shifted, just slightly. The CTO moved closer to the monitor, following the boy's suggestion without fully acknowledging it yet. The log, now viewed through a different lens, was beginning to make more sense. What had looked like random failures might not be so random after all. Another developer typed in a test script based on what the boy had said, creating a mock return for the failed call. The screen blinked. The percentage bar jumped forward, from 12% to 36% in less than a second. A sudden hush fell across the engineering team. At first, the jump on the progress bar was dismissed as coincidence. One of the engineers leaned over and said it might have just been a delayed response from an earlier patch. Another suggested the load balancer finally caught up after the system stopped receiving new commands. But then the boy stepped forward again, slowly, cautiously. "It's not done," he said, pointing at a new warning flashing in the console. "That's still waiting for an invalid parameter. If you spoof the return object there, it'll skip the blocker." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the static of the room with surprising clarity. This time, someone listened. A mid-level systems engineer, exhausted and out of options, leaned over to test what the kid had said. He typed in a quick override, creating a placeholder value for the return call in question. It was risky and certainly not best practice, but at this point, best practices had failed them. He hit enter, the screen jolted slightly, the loading bar surged again, now at 71%. A few audible gasps slipped out before people remembered they were still in front of a high-stakes investor audience. The CTO blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening, while the junior engineer who had earlier been dismissed completely turned his chair toward the kid. "I've seen that pattern before," the boy added, walking slowly up to the main terminal, still keeping his distance. "You probably reused a library that had a nested call chain from a different version of the runtime environment. If you call it without isolating it in the thread scope, it creates a lock state because the expected return never completes, so it waits forever. But if you isolate it with a dummy object and trigger the handler manually, like this," he mimicked typing with his fingers, not even at a keyboard, "then it'll skip the wait and resume the main thread." Now people were fully turning toward him. One of the software architects, the kind of guy who hadn't taken advice from anyone without a PhD in years, furrowed his brow and muttered, "That actually makes sense." Someone else asked, "Wait, how do you even know this?" But the boy didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. He just picked it up from debugging tools he had tinkered with, from reading obscure forum threads late at night, while trying to make his old laptop run games it wasn't meant to run. It was all just logic to him. If a cause is B to wait and B never happens, then make C trick B into thinking it did. Simple, in a weird way. The CTO stepped forward now, looking down at the terminal. "Try what he said," he told one of the engineers. The room hesitated for a second, still unsure. A few investors had risen halfway out of their chairs, sensing something was happening but not grasping it yet. The engineer typed in the override and added a forced trigger to continue the thread. When the return handler was spoofed, the system resumed instantly. The loading bar hit 100%. The dashboard lit up with real-time data streams. Every metric that had been frozen was now surging with fresh values. The model interfaces loaded. Predictive graphs started forming. The demo was alive. People stared at the screen in stunned silence. The software had never recovered that fast before. The CEO, still near the front, turned slowly to look at the engineers. He saw wide eyes, slumped shoulders lifting, jaws slightly open. Then he saw the kid, really saw him for the first time, not as a stray presence in the room, not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had just done what none of the trained professionals could. One of the VCs stood up fully now and walked forward. Did he just fix it?" he asked, almost whispering, like the idea was too strange to say out loud. The CTO, still watching the cascading system logs scroll smoothly past, nodded slightly. "Looks like he did." No one clapped. It wasn't the kind of moment that invited applause. It was more like watching someone do magic in real life. A silent, collective disbelief mixed with reluctant awe. A few engineers exchanged glances that were half embarrassment, half admiration. One of them even smiled, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe what had just happened. Another investor, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of tech experience behind her, took a slow step toward the kid and asked what school he went to. He shrugged and said he wasn't sure yet. The CEO stood frozen for a few moments longer than anyone else, eyes fixed not on the now functioning demo, but on the boy standing quietly beside the engineers. The system had come back online, clean and smooth, the graphs updating in real time, the AI modules showcasing their predictive capabilities exactly as planned. The crowd's attention drifted back to the screen, murmurs turning to cautious praise, a few even starting to take notes again. But the CEO wasn't looking at any of that. His mind was caught somewhere between shock and realization, trying to make sense of the paradox standing in front of him. This boy had no badge, no resume, no LinkedIn profile. No technical certification, no job title, no role in the organization. He didn't belong in the room, at least not by any professional metric the CEO had ever used. And yet, here he was, having done what an entire team of highly paid, carefully vetted, endlessly trained engineers could not. He hadn't just guessed, hadn't just lucked into a fix. He saw through the problem with a kind of clarity that cut past all the noise, straight to the root, like he understood the system not as layers of code, but as a living, breathing structure. As if he had listened to its silence and knew exactly where it hurt. The CEO slowly walked toward him, not in a rush, not with a show of executive energy, but as someone approaching a question he didn't know how to ask. The boy turned slightly, not intimidated, but unsure. His hands were in his hoodie pockets again, eyes glancing from the floor to the screen to the people now whispering around him. He seemed to sense that something important had shifted in the room, though maybe not exactly what it meant. "I don't even know your name," the CEO said quietly. The boy just shrugged a little. "Miles," he said after a beat. "I'm just here with my dad." The words hit like a reset button in the CEO mind. Just here with my dad. It was so ordinary, so human, and yet it clashed so violently with the extraordinary nature of what had just happened. The janitor's son, not even meant to be in the room, had walked in, listened, observed, and casually dismantled a crisis that had paralyzed a multi-million-dollar operation. He wasn't part of any succession plan, wasn't listed in any talent pipeline report, and still, he saw something no one else did. The engineers stood awkwardly now, half impressed, half embarrassed, uncertain how to engage with the kid who had unintentionally outshined them. One or two offered thanks, slightly stiff but sincere. The CTO was quieter than usual, still replaying the last 15 minutes in his mind, trying to reconcile how his entire department missed what a middle schooler caught by instinct. Investors, now re-engaged, began to circle the room again, their earlier skepticism softening, but their attention had shifted as well. The product was back online, yes, but that wasn't what anyone was talking about anymore. The CEO realized in that moment that everything he thought he knew about talent had a flaw. He had always believed in credentials, in pedigrees, in top schools, and high-stakes hiring. He'd sat through panel after panel discussing talent acquisition strategy, workforce development, machine learning certification pipelines, but none of those models could account for this kid. A quiet observer outside the structure entirely, solving a problem from pure understanding rather than institutional expertise. It left the CEO with a knot in his chest, not from shame, but from the weight of a new awareness settling in. How many other minds like this had been left outside the room? How much brilliance had been overlooked, dismissed, unseen, because it didn't come with a lanyard or a degree or the right vocabulary? He looked around the room again, this time seeing not just the people, but the walls they had unconsciously built around roles, expectations, appearances. And somewhere in that realization, a sense of humility began to grow, quiet and unspoken. The janitor re-entered the room a few minutes later, a little surprised to find his son surrounded by senior staff and investors. He looked confused at first, then a bit concerned. Miles looked up and just gave him a small smile, like he wasn't entirely sure what had happened either. The CEO turned to greet the man, suddenly very aware of how invisible he'd been earlier, how easily people like him blended into the background of a company's daily routine. He extended a hand and introduced himself with a level of respect that made the janitor pause before shaking it.